The chamber doors sealed behind me before I understood what that sound meant. A heavy, final click, like a lock turning on a cage I did not know I had walked into. 26 years old, standing in the visitor gallery of the compact assembly, and the air itself felt like it had turned against me. Below, on the floor of the great circular hall, the delegates of 6 founding species sat in their high seats, lights blinking above their names as the votes came in. I gripped the railing so hard my knuckles went pale. My name was Ellen Marsh, junior attaché to the human delegation, and I had come to that session expecting a routine trade hearing. Instead, I was watching my entire species get judged. The vote counter climbed. 42 in favor of exile. 45. 48. The number needed was 51 out of a possible 54 seats. My chest tightened with every new light that turned red against us. 51. The chamber went quiet in that terrible way rooms go quiet when something enormous has just happened and nobody wants to be the first to speak. A tall alien elder with silver skin folds stood at the podium and read the ruling in a flat, practiced voice, as if he had rehearsed sounding bored about ending a civilization's place among the stars. Species designation, human. Status, exiled from the compact. Effective immediately. All gate coordinates to the Sol system will be sealed. All trade licenses revoked. All compact technology support withdrawn. I felt something hot rise in my throat. Rage, humiliation, disbelief, all mixed together and looking for a place to explode. I knew things about those founding 6 species that would have shredded their reputations in front of every camera in that gallery. I knew about the mining rights they stole from smaller worlds. I knew about the votes they rigged. I knew about the ambassador from a small water world who disappeared after asking too many questions 2 years earlier, and how the official report called it an accident. I opened my mouth to shout all of it into that chamber. A hand closed gently around my wrist before a single word left me. I turned and found our head ambassador beside me, an older woman named Miriam Foss, silver-haired, calm in a way that felt unnatural for the moment. She had buried a husband during humanity's darkest early years in the compact, and had never once raised her voice about it in public. She looked at me now with steady eyes and shook her head, just slightly. "Do not give them the show they expect," she said, quiet enough that only I could hear it over the murmuring crowd. "Let them wonder why we are not fighting back. That will cost them more sleep than anything you could shout right now." I did not understand her in that moment. All I felt was fire, but I closed my mouth, and I have never been more grateful for a single choice in my entire life, because everything that came after grew out of that silence. We left the chamber in orderly rows, human delegates walking out with our heads high, saying nothing to the reporters who shoved recording devices toward our faces, saying nothing to the rival delegations, who watched us with something between triumph and unease. No parting statement, no last defiant speech, no threats. We simply walked to our ships and left. I remember standing at the viewport of our transport as it pulled away from Compact Central Station, watching those massive golden spires shrink into the dark. Somewhere in my chest a voice kept screaming that we should be doing something, anything, to answer what had just happened to us. But Miriam stood beside me at that viewport with her hands folded, watching the same view with an expression I can only describe as patient. "They think exile is a punishment because they think we need them," she told me. "We are about to show them exactly how wrong that assumption is." The journey home took 3 weeks. I spent most of it too angry to sleep properly, replaying the vote in my head, imagining 100 different ways I could have humiliated those 6 species in front of the entire assembly. When we finally reached Sol and I saw Earth again, blue and quiet, and completely unaware of the weight now resting on it, something in me finally cracked open into grief instead of rage. 32 worlds and habitats, all of them built on compact trade routes, compact currency, compact technology licenses that we paid endless fees to use but never fully owned. All of it was about to be cut away like a rope holding us to solid ground. The first year after the exile was the hardest year I have ever lived through. Compact intelligence services expected us to lash out, and honestly, so did most of humanity. Council sessions back on Earth were loud with generals and engineers and furious citizens demanding retaliation. We had a fleet, we had weapons, we had every reason for rage. I sat in on several of those sessions as a junior aide, and I watched Miriam Foss stand at the front of the room again and again, absorbing shouted questions with the same unshaken calm she showed in that assembly chamber. "We are not going to attack anyone," she said one evening, to a room full of admirals who wanted blood. "Every act of aggression we commit becomes evidence they use to justify what they did to us. They expect chaos. They expect desperation. So we are going to give them the one thing they cannot write a report about, nothing at all." It sounded like weakness to me back then. I said so, quietly. After that meeting, walking beside her through the corridors of the council building. She stopped walking and turned to face me directly, and there was something fierce underneath her calm that I had never noticed before. "Ellen," she said, using my first name for the first time since I had known her, "silence is not the absence of strength. It is strength that refuses to explain itself. They will spend years trying to guess what we are planning. Let them spend those years guessing while we spend those same years building." She was right, though it took most of a decade for me to fully understand how right she was. We threw ourselves into building because we no longer had a choice. Every piece of technology we had leased from the compact stopped working the moment support was withdrawn, and our engineers discovered something strange and wonderful in the process of replacing it all. The compact fusion reactor designs we had rented for decades, paying enormous fees for limited licenses, turned out to be deliberately restricted versions of much simpler underlying physics. Our own scientists, forced to solve the problem from scratch, built reactors within 6 years that outperformed anything the compact had ever allowed us to use. We had been renting a smaller version of our own potential the entire time. The same pattern repeated everywhere. Trade routes we thought we depended on turned out to be routes designed to keep resources flowing toward the founding 6 species more than toward us. Once those routes closed, our own shipyards and mining operations expanded to fill every gap within a few short years. Even our culture, which compact officials had always described with a strange kind of polite pity, calling us undisciplined, unpredictable, too emotional for serious diplomacy, began slipping quietly across the border anyway. Human music, human stories, human games that other species started playing in secret because nothing in the compact's own culture captured that same restless, stubborn creativity. I traveled a great deal during those years, working my way up through the diplomatic ranks that barely existed anymore since we had no one official left to negotiate with. Instead, I became something closer to an observer, gathering fragments of information from trade contacts along the old border routes, listening to rumors carried by smugglers and independent traders who still moved quietly between compact space and our own. The rumors were fascinating. Compact analysts whose entire careers were built on predicting the intentions of other species had absolutely nothing to report about humanity, except that we appeared to be doing nothing at all. Some analysts theorized we had simply collapsed after the exile and were too broken to rebuild. Others insisted we were secretly gathering forces for an enormous strike that never came. A smaller group, the ones closest to the truth, suggested something far more unsettling to the compact leadership, that we simply did not need them anymore, and that this quiet indifference was somehow more dangerous than any threat they could have prepared for. I met one of those analysts myself, years later, at a neutral trading post along the border that both sides quietly tolerated because it kept certain supply lines open. Her name was Ines Callow, and she was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, clearly nervous about speaking with someone who had actually been present at the exile vote all those years earlier. We sat across a narrow table in a dim little cafe run by a species neither of us fully trusted, and she asked me the question that had apparently haunted compact intelligence circles for 4 decades. "Why did you never retaliate?" she asked. 40 years, and not one act of aggression from your people, not one hostile transmission. Your fleet strength has grown enormously, our sensors are not blind to that, and yet you have never once postured with it, never threatened us, never even complained publicly about what happened. I do not understand how any species endures that kind of humiliation without lashing out eventually. I thought about everything I could have told her, about the corruption inside the founding 6 species that had only grown worse in the decades since our exile, now that no one remained to ask uncomfortable questions in that assembly chamber, about the smaller species who had quietly reached out to us over the years, tired of compact favoritism, curious about how a species survived and thrived entirely outside the system that claimed to be essential for civilized life, about every metric of supposed compact stability that had actually been slow decline wrapped in polished diplomatic language. Instead, I told her something simpler, something closer to the truth Miriam Foss had tried to teach me on the day everything changed. "We were never trying to hurt you," I said. "We were done asking for your permission to exist. That is a very different thing from anger. Anger needs an audience. What we did needed nothing but time." She did not have an answer for that. I do not think anyone in the compact ever fully did. The years kept moving forward, faster than I expected, the way they always do once you stop measuring your life by what you lost, and start measuring it by what you are building instead. Earth grew into something unrecognizable from the world I had left behind on the day of the exile vote. New shipyards stretched along the edges of our solar system, built entirely from human designs, human materials, human ingenuity, that no longer depended on anyone else's approval. Colonies we had struggled to sustain under compact trade restrictions suddenly flourished once we controlled our own resources fully. Miriam Foss did not live to see all of it. She passed quietly in her sleep during the 23rd year after the exile, and I stood at her memorial service alongside thousands of others who had learned patience from her example, wondering if she had any idea, back in that assembly gallery all those years earlier, just how completely her single quiet choice would shape everything that followed. I think she did know. I think that is exactly why she reached for my wrist that day instead of letting me speak. By the 40th year after the exile, I was no longer a junior aide, but the closest thing humanity had to a senior voice on matters concerning the wider galaxy. A strange kind of authority, built entirely from decades of listening, rather than decades of speaking. It was in that role that I found myself sitting across from Ines Callow one final time, in a different meeting room, this one more official than our first quiet conversation at the border post years earlier. She had risen through the ranks of compact intelligence herself by then, and she came to that meeting with a proposal that surprised me. The founding 6 species, weakened by decades of quiet decline and growing unrest among their smaller member worlds, wanted to formally reopen contact with humanity. They wanted trade. They wanted technology exchange. They wanted, though none of them said the word directly, something close to an apology dressed up in diplomatic language designed to avoid admitting any actual wrongdoing. I listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, the same patient silence Miriam had taught me decades earlier, and when Ines finished speaking, she looked at me with an expression that mixed hope and genuine uncertainty about how I would respond. "What do you want in return?" she asked. "What would it take for humanity to consider this?" I thought about that question for a long moment, watching her face, remembering the gallery, remembering Miriam's steady hand on my wrist, remembering 40 years of quiet, deliberate building that had turned exile into the single greatest opportunity our species had ever been given. "Nothing that resembles what we had before," I finally said. "No trade routes that favor your founding worlds over everyone else. No technology licenses that keep smaller species dependent forever. No assembly votes weighted to protect 6 seats at the expense of every other voice in that chamber. If humanity returns to any relationship with the Compact, it will be as equals, or it will not happen at all." She sat quietly with that answer for a long moment before nodding slowly, and something in her expression told me she had expected exactly that response, perhaps had even hoped for it. The negotiations that followed took another 3 years to complete, slow and careful, built on terms that finally treated every species at that table as genuinely equal partners rather than ranked participants in someone else's hierarchy. I sat at the head of the human delegation during the final signing ceremony, held not in the old assembly chamber but in a newly built neutral station specifically designed for the occasion, and I thought about that frightened 26-year-old who had stood in a gallery decades earlier, ready to scream every secret she knew into a room full of people who would not have listened anyway. Silence had done what anger never could have accomplished. It had given us time to grow into a species no one could dismiss again, and it had given the Compact decades to slowly realize on their own, without a single hostile word from us, exactly how much they had underestimated by casting us out. Walking out of that final ceremony, back toward the transport that would carry the human delegation home, a young aide fell into step beside me, clearly nervous, clearly eager to understand something she could not quite articulate yet. "How did you know it would work?" she asked. 40 years of silence, with no guarantee any of it would lead anywhere. How did you have that kind of patience? I smiled at her question, because it was the same question I had once asked Miriam Foss, standing in a very similar hallway decades earlier. I did not have patience at first, I told her honestly. I had someone who believed in patience enough for both of us until I learned to believe in it myself. Exile only works as a punishment if the exiled still need permission to exist. We simply stopped needing that permission, and once we stopped needing it, there was nothing left for anyone to punish. She considered that answer quietly as we walked, and I found myself thinking, not for the first time, about how strange it was that the greatest victory humanity ever achieved among the stars had required no weapons fired, no threats made, no single dramatic moment that historians could point to and call decisive, just decades of quiet, stubborn building, and a woman with silver hair who understood, long before I did, that the loudest thing a wounded people can ever do is refuse to explain themselves to those who wounded them. The transport doors closed behind us, sealing us inside for the journey home, and this time the sound did not feel like a cage. It felt like the closing of a very long chapter, one that had begun with fury in a gallery, and ended, 43 years later, with an entire galaxy finally understanding what humanity had known all along. We were never asking to be let back in. We were simply waiting for the rest of the stars to catch up to what we had already built without them.